to the views of Mr. Mike Trace years ago in relation to drug policy?
I think it would be fair to say that Michael and I had similar views, yes.
You were also involved in the Runciman Police Foundation review.
Correct.
Which again pertained to, let's call them liberalised drug policy, relaxed drug policy.
Well, I don't think that's fair. I think our report was an attempt to review the evidential base for the UK drug policy, and we came up with some conclusions which actually were generally well received by the government and by the media. As they weren't liberal, they were rational, I think.
You made an interesting suggestion yesterday in evidence relating to a commission that should be set up in relation to drug policy. Do you recall that statement of yours?
Yeah, I do.
That would suggest well, do I understand from that that you have some experience of drug commissions?
Well, the Runciman report was one, yes.
Any others?
Well,
more recently?
Every decision that the Advisory Council made during the period, the 9 years I served on it, was made in the form of a commission. We had a chair, me or Mike Rawlins. We took evidence, public hearings, and then wrote our report. So, yes, I have some experience in that.
I want to make a put a statement to you, Professor, that for which you'll appreciate I have spent all this time in cross-examination with you laying a basis for, which is why it was necessary that I addressed so much of your own evidence. And that is that for the last 20 years, Professor, you've been a crusader for relaxed drug policy, last approximate 20 years of your professional career.
No, that is a ridiculous statement, because, and the evidence for it being ridiculous is this. So whilst I was on the ACMD, my committee, the scientific committee, recommended controlling, making illegal ketamine and GHB and rescheduling upwards of methamphetamine. Now, I have always taken what I consider to be the best evidence view of the harms of drugs. So I have actually been considered by some people as a dangerous prohibitionist because of my attitudes to those drugs, or at least because our analysis came to the conclusion they should be controlled. I'm also being condemned by people who drink alcohol as being anti-alcohols. I can't remotely be seen as being someone who has a general pro-drug approach.
I used the words relaxed drug policy. That seems to tie in with what you've just said.
Well, I think that's I don't think the people who now are convicted of ketamine possession or GHB possession would see that my policy is relaxed. My policy is rational. It's based on harm, and it's based about trying to minimise harm. And it's not my policy, or it's the policy that's been enacted by my government, to some extent on my advice.
So, are you... I want to ask you again, or put it to you that the words I used were relaxed drug policy. Is there a reason you don't like those words? Because they seem to tie up with everything you've said, particularly under cross-examination.
So, well, relaxed, I don't know what you mean by relaxed. I like a policy which was based on the best evidence and which covered, in a logical and, I think, balanced, transparent way, our attitude to all drugs. That's why I suggested a commission.
You're a scientist first and foremost, are you not?
As opposed to a psychiatrist.
Okay, so are you a psychiatrist, a medical doctor first and foremost, and then a scientist?
It's a good question. I think I would consider myself a scientist first now.
Here's another good question. What is your interest in policy?
Well, my interest in policy stems from the fact that drug policies, I believe, should be evidence-based. That is the underpinning philosophy of our Misuse of Drugs Act. It's the underpinning philosophy of the United Nations and the WHO conventions. They should be based on evidence rather than being seen as being arbitrary and also inflexible and not responding to modern needs.
It has been exceedingly difficult, I'm going to argue to His Lordship, to discern in your evidence whether you gave your evidence as a medical doctor, a scientist, a campaigner, an advocate for liberalised drug laws, or a crusader for relaxed drug policy.
I gave my evidence as I would contend one of the world's leading experts on drugs, drug harms, the effects of drugs on the brain, the medicinal effects of drugs, and how they relate to policy.
Could I ask you to take up file 2, and we're going to return to your expert summary. At page 137 first, in paragraph 2.1.1, your statement in the second sentence is, it is inconceivable to the expert that its use and possession remains illegal. That's cannabis. And
sorry, excuse me, I haven't. Where are we?
2.1.1, the last sentence on the page.
Oh, the bottom of the page.
It is inconceivable to the expert that its use and possession remains illegal. I want to put it to you that that statement contradicts the very evidence you've given in this court.
Well, no, I think I don't want to really go back over the evidence and over the analysis we did, but the prohibitionist effect of the prohibition of cannabis, I think I demonstrated, leads to the worst possible outcomes for society.
If we can go to 2.1.5, you say, however, the expert... Oh, sorry, I want to take you to 2.1.4 first. You say the expert is very well aware of a multitude of ill effects allegedly associated with cannabis. I want to put to you that your evidence, your own evidence, decries your use of the word allegedly in this sentence.
So, to take them one by one, schizophrenia, well, even Robin Murray says, and I can quote it if you like.
No, we're not interested in the evidence of Robin Murray, we're interested in your evidence.
Well, so the proof, allegedly schizophrenia, there's not proof of causation. Decrease in IQ and motivation, it's not clear whether that is a real change in a person's IQ or whether that's the effect of the drug. Respiratory disease, we've read the papers you gave me this morning, which seem to support the fact that there's little effect in respiratory disease. confer the fact that the cancer risk is very low. And dependency, yes. And I agree. I have said consistently it does cause dependency, as I've made clear.
You then, in your summary, work your evidence in the summary, not that that's evidence, but you work your summary up to page 147. Paragraph 2.4.1.8. Well, let's start with 2.4.1.7. Your premise is that education around and further scientific research into cannabis can be considered very positive outcomes. And then you say, therefore, the expert opines that the deregulation and or full legalization of the use and possession of cannabis constitutes an effective means to manage the substance. In fact, you go on to describe the substance as being shown, scientifically shown, to not present, at a minimum, full extent of the harms espoused by prohibitionists, which may have significant therapeutic potential. Allow me to read it fully for the record. Therefore, the expert opines that the deregulation and or full legalization of the use and possession of cannabis constitutes an effective means to manage a substance that has been scientifically shown to not present the, and then in brackets, at a minimum full extent of the, brackets, harms espoused by prohibitionists which may have significant therapeutic potential. You very clearly pitch yourself on the other side of prohibition, and we understand that. But you make it clear that you want deregulation and or full legalization of the use and possession of cannabis. That you contend for that.
That is true, and as I have showed you through our research, that on page 33 of the slides, state control, which is a form of deregulation, is the preferred option. The free market comes second. Decriminalisation comes third. So, based on our research, this statement seems to me correct.
Well, when Advocate Bakaba put the statement to you, you said you did not contend for full legalisation.
Well, this is true, and as I say, now, based on the research we have done, we, subsequent to this, we now see, I can now see that the best evidence we have is that state control would be the most sensible way forward.
So,
sorry, and let me preface that again. In Europe, we would need to do this with South African experts to conclude the same here.
And I understand from that that you no longer contend for full legalization of the use and possession of cannabis?
If legalization means the free market, no. If legalization means no penalties for use or possession, then I would be content.
What do you understand the plaintiffs would like in this case? What is their case before this court?
My understanding is that they would like people to be able to use cannabis recreationally without fear of prosecution.
They'd like to grow it?
Pardon me?
Would they like to grow it?
I believe they would. Yes.
They already do, I understand.
I don't know that. Yeah.
Well, they have, certainly in the past. They'd like to sell it and deal in it?
Well, they may well do.
Well, have you looked at their site, the Fogfist site, which they manage and out of which they support themselves, according to articles that they have
I haven't
given the media?
I haven't certainly spent a lot of time on their site now.
Well, an article in the media, it can be produced if necessary, describes their cause, over the last number of years to this end, for which we're before court, describes how they've created this movement. There are subsidies, or people pay monies in support of the cause. They live off the proceeds. And if you then inspect the rest of the site to the various pages, one sees how products are promoted, advice is given in relation to oil use. To me, it smacks of a desire or an intention to create a commercialized environment for cannabis.
Well, it might do. I think, well, it might be that if you did this in South Africa, it might turn out that some kind of open market would be preferred in South Africa. I don't know, but the evidence I've suggested to you and that I prefer is a regulated market.
If people are giving advice who are not scientifically and medically trained, such as yourself and others, to not use or to stop their chemotherapy and rather use cannabis oil, would you second that approach and that advice? In other words, the approach being them not being medically qualified, firstly, and secondly, the actual advice, cease chemotherapy and use cannabis oil?
Of course not.
Thank you. So, if I'm correct in my brief summation and discourse with you over what I understand their case to be, you don't support that case?
Well, I wouldn't support anyone wanting to prejudge the decision of an oncologist to provide what they believe is the best treatment. I mean, it may be that those patients might get some added benefit from cannabis. Might be that the chemotherapy isn't working, in which case people could do what many people do and try cannabis-based medicines.
Maybe I didn't make the question clear, and I'll repeat it. Forgive me if I didn't. But when I speak of their case, it's their case for a commercialized environment. If that's their case ultimately, to create a commercialized environment where they can grow, not just use, they would like to grow, they'd want to be able to transport it, they'd like to be able to sell it, and the medicinal side of it, all the commercial aspects of it, you wouldn't support that case?
Well, I would prefer state control. Yes, I would prefer state control. Yes.
Professor, with respect, that is not, we're going to argue to His Lordship, that is not how we understand either your summary nor your evidence in court, particularly under when you were led in chief.
Mm-hmm.
We don't understand your evidence to be that, and it appears to us that you have changed your front.
As I recall, I did present this when I was under evidence in chief.
And we say that the reason for that is that you've been caught out coming before this court, acting like an activist, using this court and the witness stand as a soapbox to grandstand for your own ideals for the relaxation of drug laws.
No, that's outrageous, and it's incorrect. I've explained several times why it's incorrect. What I'm here for, and let's face it, I've spent 10 days here doing my best to give the court the best knowledge I can, acquired over 30 years of research, maybe more, into the harms of cannabis, the potential medical benefits of cannabis, the way in which the current laws impede research and have done so in the most egregious manner for the last 50 years, and to encourage you in South Africa to try to do something better than we have.
We will also argue to His Lordship that just as you did in the United Kingdom in relation to particularly your government and in respect of public trust, you've abused your position in this court as a supposed expert witness and you've promoted your own ideals.
Well, what I have done is I have promoted what is arguably the most systematic assessment of the harms of drugs, including cannabis, that has ever been conducted in a rational, thorough, transparent way for the past 20 years. And that is what I thought I was here to do.
You, on your own evidence, said you came to give 3 opinions. The one was in relation to the harms of cannabis. We've discussed that. The other was in relation to the potential medical use of cannabis. We've discussed that. But the third one, which we have been forced to debate with you, was never ever foreshadowed in your summary of evidence, and that is a way in which cannabis can be regulated.
Well, the evidence, you saw several papers that I was party to relating to the control of cannabis in the United Kingdom, which is all about regulation.
If that was meant to be the opinion which the plaintiffs and the legal representatives sought for you to give, firstly, it would have been foreshadowed in your summary of evidence, and secondly, there would have been very specific questions asked of you by their counsel. Neither of those occurred. Your comment to that?
Well, it's hard to comment because it seemed to me that I have shared with the court everything I was asked to share, and I think I covered the topics repeatedly that you raised.
Professor, I put it to you, which we will argue to His Lordship, that what your evidence demonstrates, both in your evidence in chief as well as under cross-examination, that you went off on a frolic of your own in your giving of evidence. You did not stay within the bounds of either the evidence required of you or the questions asked of you in cross-examination.
Well, I would argue, my Lord, that what I have done is tried to represent the truth of the question about cannabis and its harms and its potential to the best of my ability.
Professor, I thank you. The record will speak for itself. Thank you, my Lord. No further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Willis. Mr. Mohammed, thank you. Re-examination.
Professor Nutt, if I could ask you to take out a number of files. The file 9.
Yes. Pages.
329. File 9B as well.
1 moment. File.
9B, that's file 9 at page 329.
Okay. Yes, and the next one?
File 9B, page 1205.
So what was the first page?
Mr. Mohammed, just 1 moment.
So,
First one was file 9 page.
file 9, page 329.
Yes?
Then
The next one was file.
the second one was file 9B. At page 1205. And then the next one, my Lord. The next one is file 5.
Page.
148. And then the last one.
No, one more. I think this is now.
Sorry if it's becoming cumbersome. My lord.
You did say file 5.
File 5, my lord, yes.
5, but I don't see that page number that you're referring to. 148.
148, my lord. Yes, file 5 is divided into 2 dividers, if I recall correctly.
No.
3 dividers. And the 148 is in the 8th defendant's expert bundle. Page 148.
Is that with the heading, does marijuana kill?
Yes, my lord. And then the last one, my lord, apologize. It's on a very narrow issue, so shortly we'll be able to put most if not all of them away.
The last one?
The last one is file 2, which you might already have before you, Lord,
Yes.
at page 51.
Yes.
Thank you. Professor Nutt, it was put to you under cross-examination by my learned friend for the 8th defendant. When you were dealing with the toxicity of cannabis and the likelihood that someone would die directly at the point in time of smoking a cannabis cigarette, a joint.
Correct.
You indicated that there's no evidence to suggest that anyone's ever died from a cannabis overdose, and the learned friend put to you that there's no research that shows that you can't overdose from cannabis. In the 1st to 7th defendant's evidence, which they've now provided in the trial bundle at page 329,
I have it.
it in fact starts at page 328, and it's an article by Wayne Hall and Nadia, sorry if I get the pronunciation correct, Solowich.
I think so.
And at page 329, directly above, on the left-hand side, directly above the heading that says psychomotor effects in driving, the paragraph just above that. Do you have that?
I have it.
It reads, the acute toxicity of cannabinoids is very low. There are no confirmed published cases worldwide of human deaths from cannabis poisoning, and the dose of THC required to produce 50% mortality in rodents is extremely high compared with other commonly used drugs. Pause there. I'm going to read all these paragraphs to you and then ask you for your comment. Then, in file 9B at page 1025.
1205.
You said page 329. That was in file 9.
File 9 was page 329. Yes, my lord. Lordship will see on that page in the top right there's a picture of a cannabis plant.
Yes, I have that. And I think there's. Then you referred to 9B.
9B.
That was at page.
1205.
Yes, I have that. Then there was page, in volume 5, page 138.
Yes.
Yes, that I have. And then in volume 2, you referred to
Page 51.
page 51.
So I'm now, my lord, at page 1205. This again, Professor Nutt, is the evidence put up by the first to seventh defendants, that's the state defendants. And you'll see on that page is from a document entitled The Health and Social Effects of Non-Medical Cannabis Use, under the broader heading Short-Term Effects of Cannabis, and specifically paragraph 5.1.3 on page 1205.
I'm here.
It reads, acute toxicity. The risk of a fatal cannabis overdose is extremely small compared to the risks of opioid and stimulant drug overdoses. The dose of THC that reliably kills rodents is extremely high, and the equivalent fatal dose in humans extrapolated from animal studies is between 15 grams and 70 grams. This is much greater than the amount of cannabis that a very heavy user would consume in a day. There are no reports of fatal overdoses in the epidemiological literature. See that?
Right.
Then, if we could go to file 2, yes, it's pointed out to me that the whole quote finishes with the lack of respiratory overdoses is consistent with the absence of cannabinoid receptors in brainstem areas that control respiration. The next quote is at page 51 in file 2.
Yes.
This, in fact, commences at page 50. It's an article entitled Medicinal Cannabis, Rational Guidelines for Dosing. And on page 51, on the right-hand side, under the heading Clinical Pharmacology, it says this: although it is a potent drug that may produce psychoactive effects, THC and the other cannabinoids has relatively low toxicity, and lethal doses in humans have not been described. He gives 2 authorities there. The theoretical lethal dose value is estimated to be 1 in 20,000 or 1 to 40,000 using a single cannabis cigarette as a unit of dose. Conversely stated, a human would have to consume 20,000 to 40,000 fold the amount of cannabis contained in one cigarette in a short period of time to achieve lethality. Using this as a basis, it has been estimated that 628 kilograms of cannabis would have to be smoked in 15 minutes to induce a lethal effect. And then finally we see what Professor Madras says at page 148 in file 5 in her slideshow that she produces. Well, she doesn't go into that detail, but she says, page 148, it is highly unlikely to die of a marijuana overdose. Bearing that in mind, what do you say to my learned friend's proposition that there's no research that shows you can't overdose from cannabis?
Well, I would say what I said to him before, that we know it has a very, very high safety margin, and that the scores we made when we did the MCDA were based on this kind of evidence, and that's why it was scored 0 in terms of drug-specific mortality.
Then if I could ask you to turn to the Washington State Marijuana Impact Report, which was presented to you. It's in the 8th Defendants Trial Bundle.
Can I put these away?
File 7.
Can I close?
Yes, these can be closed now, my lord. You may want to leave file 2 open. We'll come to that in due course. File 7, page 303.
Three?
303 of file 7.
Yes. 303. It's a table? No? Oh.
I'm looking for file 7.
Sorry.
We have the court files which we referred to previously, volumes 1 to 6. Then started
You need to colour code them.
trial bundles, which are from file 1, 2, 3 onwards. So are you referring to the trial bundle you said of the 8th defendant?
The 8th defendant's trial bundle.
Volume 7.
I believe it's volume 7.
7, yeah, 7, 7.
How's this? This is your trial bundle. So what do you
I
want?
don't seem to have it.
It starts at 10. The trial bundle starts at 10.
I'm told the moment.
These are the trial. Was that not
Sorry.
the one that was to have been provided later? I see Mr. Bokava says.
Which document is it?
I'm told by my attorney, my lord, it's in fact file 13. I apologize.
File
File
13.
13. I apologize, my lord. It's been difficult to keep track because the didn't all come in at once.
File 13 page.
Page 303.
Is that the one that says Washington State Marijuana Impact Report?
Yes.
Yes.
Professor Nutt, this document was put to you under cross-examination by my learned friend for the 8th defendant, do you recall?
I do.
Before it was introduced into evidence during the course of this trial, had you ever had an opportunity to study the document?
I had not.
Had you seen it before?
I had not. No.
We referred you in particular to page 384.
Yes.
This dealt with seizures of cannabis. And what was put to you was the paragraph under the second table, starting with the words, despite the overall decline. Remember that?
I do.
It reads, despite the overall decline in seizures in the state, the activities associated with one age group have countered this trend. In 2010, youth 12 to 17 years old were represented in 29.9% of all seizures. In 2012, they were represented in 36.7% of seizures. In 2013, they were represented in 69.3% of total seizures. Youth seizures peaked in 2014, representing 73.7% of total seizures. By the end of 2015, 64.9% of seizures involved youth aged 12 to 17. And the impression which one gained was that this was suggesting that youth seizures in the age category of 12 to 17 years was in fact going up. But if we look at the table from which this information is gleaned, we see a number of bars representing number of seizures in the different age groups, 12 to 17, 18 to 25, 26 plus, and all other ages. And from 2012 to 2015, we see that in total, seizures have gone down. You see that?
Correct, yes.
And on the left of each set of bars is the category 12 to 17 years.
Yes.
In 2012, it was 2,368. In 2013, it was 1,836. In 2014, it was 1,768. And in 2015 is 1,570.
Correct.
So it shows that youth seizures in fact went down.
They did.
And in fact we see that 18 to 25 went down from 3,364 in 2012, 1,239 in 2013, to 1,015 in 2014, and then slightly up to 1,156, but still much less than in 2012.
Correct.
And 26 plus, we see in 2012 there were 2,680 seizures. That went down significantly to 516 seizures in 2013. Went down again to 467 seizures in 2014. And went down again to 428 seizures. And so, the paragraph underneath is talking about percentages. The graph above is talking about the number of seizures.
Correct.
And we see that across the board, seizures reduced significantly between 2012 and 2015, post-legalization in Washington, correct?
Correct.
So how does one explain this paragraph about the percentage of youth seizures relative to other seizures increasing?
Well, it's because the total number of seizures has declined, and there's been a proportionately greater decline in the older age group, and that gives the impression that there's been an increase in the total number of seizures in the youth, but in fact they have fallen. So this is a misuse of percentages, really, because the divisor is actually changing significantly.
And the opening statement of this paragraph, despite the overall decline in seizures in the state, the activities associated with one age group have countered this trend. What do you say about that statement?
Well, it's wrong.
You recall it was put to you by my learned friend for the 8th defendant that, I can't remember who it was, I don't know, perhaps if they're going to come and explain themselves, that someone suggested that you were fast and loose with statistics. What do you say about that?
That was a reported quote from Professor Murray, and I would say that I do my best to be accurate with statistics.
Thank you, Myrtle. That file can be put away.
Sorry.
Okay. That file can be put away.
Aye.
If I could ask then, my Lord, that we look to file number 8 as the plaintiff's trial bundle.
Now, when you say file number 8, I'm supposed to again.
Sorry, my Lord. I realize it's cumbersome, my Lord.
Is it numbered perhaps differently, volume something else?
Lord, it will be called Plaintiff's Trial Bundle. And this Plaintiff's Trial Bundle consists of 2 volumes.
Yes, but they numbered at the top as file 1 and file...
It'll be file 2, yes, thank you. Lord, we'll fix up the file labels.
So you're referring to now?
Plaintiff's Trial Bundle, file 2.
File 2.
The very last document, my Lord, at page 635. If it's found its way into your Lordship file. You have it, yes, my Lord?
I do.
Does your Lordship have it?
Yes.
Professor Nutt, you were taken through fairly extensively a number of documents produced by the WHO, the World Health Organization, cannabinoids, and and the other one was cardiovascular. But Mr. Willis, for the eighth offender, my learned friend, dealt extensively with a number of the other ones. Quite frankly, my lord, Mr. Bakaba accuses the witness of not providing credible scientific evidence, asks him to provide it, elects himself not to go through it. But my lord, the fact of the matter is these conditions were dealt with extensively, and he's provided the documentation. I might also point out, my lord, that what I'm reading from here is duplicated, my lord, in the first to seventh defendants trial bundle. They put up this entire publication, my lord, after cross-examination, examination in chief, with this witness at close.
Yes.
My Lord,
allow it.
My Lord, might I weigh in on the argument? I have elected, unlike Mr. Bakaba, to sit back and at some stage to place the following on record. I'm going to use this opportunity, if you would allow me, my Lord. My learned friend's re-examination is not, we're not in agreement with all of his re-examination. But much like one treats repeated use of hearsay evidence, one places sometimes the objection on record once, just to make your Lord alive to the fact that we're not objecting, but we'll leave it for argument later. That's the position I would like to take. But my Lord, my learned friend's not entirely correct in what he's just submitted to your Lordship. When Mr. Bakaba challenged the Professor on where is this credible scientific evidence, which are words that come out of his own summary, he wasn't challenging him to give him an opportunity, simply to provide an opportunity for his counsel to come back and reply. This reply is used for clarification. Where there are disputed areas, it's there to be of assistance to your Lordship. It is open to Mr. Bakaba to decide whether he wants to use that documentation to cross-examine the witness with or not. Just because Mr. Bakaba doesn't raise it, or because I later cross-examine the witness on issues that might arise in that document, does not suffice for our learned friend to cross-examine or re-examine out of the document. That's not the test, my Lord. The first test is whether or not there are areas of confusion where the witness deserves an opportunity to remedy the confusion that may have arisen. But, my Lord, what this does is may give rise to a need for us to seek leave to cross-examine again, my Lord. That's the difficulty, ultimately.
Mr.
My Lord, the fact of the matter is that the question of whether or not there was credible evidence to support the conclusion that cannabis is can effectively be used to treat or prevent chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting was pertinently dealt with under cross-examination. I'm entitled to deal with that in reply.
Yes, I'll allow it.
Thank you. So page 263.14, isn't it? Under the heading chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting.
Sorry, 263 point?
Point 14.
You dealt with this?
Yes, thank you. I in fact dealt with that. And I was coming...
you were at 17.
Yes, to 263.17, where the conclusion of this chapter is, there is conclusive evidence that oral cannabinoids are effective antiemetics in the treatment of chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting. Could you explain could you translate this for us, Professor Nutt, into layman's terms?
Well, this tells us that these experts believe that oral cannabinoids can help reduce both the sense of nausea and I think also the vomiting that occurs when people are treated with cancer by chemotherapy. It stops them feeling so nauseous and it reduces the vomiting. So this is evidence of an ability of cannabis products to treat this disorder. All these symptoms.
Right. You'll recall, in regard to the question of HIV and AIDS,
Yes.
that Mr. Bukabe, SC, my learned friend for the state, suggested to you that you were making a reckless statement because you were saying that cannabis can cure AIDS. Clarify, is that what you were saying?
No, of course not. That would be a preposterous statement.
What were you saying?
What I was saying was that cannabis or cannabis products may have utility in dealing with some of the symptoms of AIDS and some of the symptoms of the treatment of AIDS, such as pain, such as nausea, such as wasting.
Can I ask you to turn to page 263.18? Under the heading Anorexia and Weight Loss. The question is posed, are cannabis or cannabinoids an effective treatment for anorexia and weight loss associated with HIV/AIDS, cancer-associated anorexia, cachexia syndrome, and anorexia nervosa? The last sentence on that page, under the heading AIDS wasting syndrome, the review authors concluded that there was some evidence suggesting that cannabinoids were effective in weight gain in HIV.
Correct.
On page 263.21, under the heading Discussion of Findings, says there is some evidence for oral cannabinoids being able to increase weight in patients with the HIV-associated wasting syndrome and anorexia nervosa. Could you tell us what is HIV-associated wasting syndrome and what is anorexia nervosa?
HIV-associated wasting syndrome is, and anorexia nervosa, they're conditions where people lose weight. In anorexia nervosa, there is an intention to lose weight. People voluntarily restrict their food intake. In AIDS wasting syndrome, it's less understood what's happening, but it's a state, probably a combination of peripheral and central effects of the AIDS virus to reduce appetite and also to dampen down the body's ability to maintain muscle mass.
Goes on to say no benefit has been demonstrated in cancer-associated anorexia cachexia syndrome. The studies have generally been small and of short duration and may not have investigated the optimal dose of the cannabinoid. In one study in HIV patients, both dronabinol and inhaled cannabis increased weight significantly compared to the placebo dronabinol. Cannabis has long been felt to have an orexigenic effect, increasing food intake. Can you explain that?
Well, that's called the munchies. I mean, people who smoke cannabis very commonly describe that they get hungry. And so that's what's called an orexigenic effect. Orexigenic means driving appetite.
And the conclusion, 4-4A, there is limited evidence that cannabis and oral cannabinoids are effective in increasing appetite and decreasing weight loss associated with HIV/AIDS.
Correct.
Then if I could ask you to turn to page 263.22 over the page.
I am there.
This is a case report entitled Cannabis Improves Symptoms of ADHD. Explain to us, what is ADHD?
ADHD is a brain syndrome. It stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. And people who suffer from it have characteristic problems with impulse control, with attentional control. They can't focus, their eyes are always over the place. And sometimes they're hyperactive. Sometimes they especially in young children, they run around rather than sitting still in the class.
In this document, in the abstract, it reads, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, ADHD, is characterized by attention deficits and an altered activation level. The purpose of this case investigation was to highlight that people with ADHD can benefit in some cases from the consumption of THC. A 28-year-old male who showed improper behavior and appeared to be very maladjusted and inattentive while sober appeared to be completely inconspicuous while having a very high blood plasma level of delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, THC. Performance tests, which were conducted with the test batteries ART 2020 and TAP, provided sufficient and partly over-average results in driving-related performance. Thus, it has to be considered that in the case of ADHD, THC can have atypical effects and can even lead to an enhanced driving-related performance.
That is correct.
The conclusion is at page 263.24. Just read the first sentence under the heading Conclusion. The present case report suggests that individuals suffering from ADHD, a dysfunction with a symptomatic change in activity levels, may in some cases benefit from cannabis treatment in that it appears to regulate activation to a level which may be considered optimum for performance. Just explain that to us, please.
So typically, people with ADHD are poor drivers. They don't pay attention to the car in front or the cars beside. They're thinking of other things. In fact, in some countries, if you have a diagnosis of ADHD, you are not allowed to drive unless you have treatment. And there are established treatments for ADHD. Those are amphetamines and Ritalin, methylphenidate. And what this is showing is that in this particular person, cannabis had a beneficial effect, which actually these, I think, did not previously show. So this is a very interesting observation. But it's interesting not because of this case, but because it accords with a considerable amount of what you might call teacher-related insights from America. There's a group in America of teachers who believe that cannabis is a better treatment for their children in their class with ADHD than stimulants like Ritalin. And there's a whole organisation trying to encourage research into the value of cannabis for the treatment of ADHD. And in fact, colleagues of mine in London have just conducted a trial specifically of this question. We're waiting the final results.
And if I could turn you to 263.38. This is Biomed Central Harm Reduction Journal, entitled Cannabis as a Substitute for Alcohol and Other Drugs. The abstract reads, substitution can be operationalized as the conscious choice to use one drug, legal or illicit, instead of or in conjunction with another, due to issues such as perceived safety, level of addiction potential, effectiveness in relieving symptoms, access and level of acceptance. This practice of substitution has been observed among individuals using cannabis for medical purposes. This study examined drug and alcohol use and the occurrence of substitution among medical cannabis patients. The conclusion at the bottom of that page reads, the substitution of one psychoactive substance for another with the goal of reducing negative outcomes can be included within the framework of harm reduction. Medical cannabis patients have been engaging in substitution by using cannabis as an alternative to alcohol, prescription, and illicit drugs. Explain that these findings to us, please.
So this is a survey of how people use medical cannabis to assist them with problems with other drugs. And if you go to the results section, you see that they if you go to the bottom of the results paragraph, 40% use cannabis as a substitute for alcohol, 26% as a substitute for illicit drugs, and 66% as a substitute for prescription drugs. And the reasons they did it are illustrated in the next sentence. The most common reasons given for substituting were less adverse side effects, better symptom management, less withdrawal potential with cannabis. So here you have people who are in a sense self-medicating. I imagine they're not, I'm not sure, it's not clear whether they're getting these prescribed for those indications, but they are using medical marijuana to try to deal with what they see as greater problems, such as alcohol dependence and prescription drug use. And this is a very, very well-established principle right across the whole range of treatments for people who use drugs. It's always preferable to use a less harmful drug. And most countries, I believe even South Africa, have policies in place to try to administer less harmful drugs to people who are using more harmful drugs to get them off. And, well, examples of that would be methadone and buprenorphine for opiates.
The conclusion is at page 263.41. It reads, the substitution of one psychoactive substance for another with the goal of reducing negative outcomes can be included within the framework of harm reduction. Medical cannabis patients have been engaging in substitution by using cannabis as an alternative to alcohol, prescription, and illicit drugs. This brings up two important points. First, self-determination, the right of an individual to decide which treatment or substance is most effective and least harmful for them. If an individual finds less harm in cannabis than in the drug prescribed by their doctor, do they have a right to choose? Secondly, the recognition that substitution might be a viable alternative to abstinence for those who are not able or do not wish to stop using psychoactive substances completely. What is your take on that?
Well, I think this is an example of what we're seeing more and more, that patients are becoming empowered to make decisions about their own lives. And it's been very difficult for patients up till now to be able to do that. But because cannabis is relatively easy to get in countries like the USA, people are experimenting with it and discovering it is useful. And of course, one might say, well, that was known 100 years ago, but deliberately obscured by international policies. So this is one of the reasons I am very much in favour of medical marijuana and very much against the idea that you do nothing until some drug company somewhere in the world has spent $1 billion showing that some components of cannabis work, because that, as I said, won't happen. And people are doing it now, and it's important we collate that data to advise doctors and other patients.
Then, if I could ask you to turn to 263.45.
Yes.
This is a concise report, Rheumatology, Advanced Access publication of 9 November 2005, preliminary assessment of the efficacy, tolerability, and safety of a cannabis-based medicine, Sativex, in the treatment of pain caused by rheumatoid arthritis. The objectives: to assess the efficacy of a cannabis-based medicine, CBM, in the treatment of pain due to rheumatoid arthritis. The conclusion: in the first ever controlled trial of a CBM in RA, rheumatoid arthritis, a significant analgesic effect was observed and disease activity was significantly suppressed following Sativex treatment. Whilst the differences are small and variable across the population, they represent benefits of clinical relevance and show the need for more detailed investigation in this indication. Explain that.
So rheumatoid arthritis is an arthritis which is caused when the body attacks itself, the immune system in the body attacks the joints, and it's associated with inflammation of the joints, pain in the joints. The pain is often very disruptive to sleep, and in the morning they often have considerable degree of stiffness. It's typically treated by what we call non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, drugs like ibuprofen, sometimes with drugs like steroids, which are potentially quite harmful, and many patients continue to have problems. I myself have done studies on the sleep disruption of people with rheumatoid arthritis. It's very profound. They wake up considerably more than the normal population. So what this shows is that this is Sativex. This is this mixture of THC and cannabidiol that we've talked about previously. And it shows it does have some value in reducing pain when they walk, pain at rest, improving sleep quality.
I presume there was no pun intended when you said it attacks the joints.
There was definitely no pun intended. I'm too tired to be humorous.
If I could take you back to 263.43.
Yes.
This is entitled Cannabinoids Remove Plaque-Forming Alzheimer's Proteins from Brain Cells.
Yes.
Take us through this, please.
Well, we all know that Alzheimer's disease is becoming one of the serious challenges certainly to Western society. And the incidence is growing as the population gets older. We're not entirely sure what causes Alzheimer's disease, and at present we don't have any treatment to prevent it. We have treatments that can help people with the memory loss and to some extent help them with the behavioral disturbance, but we can't stop the disease. One of the theories is that the disease is due to the deposition in the brain of a particular protein called amyloid. And amyloid is a normal, it's like a lubricant for the brain, but it's quite a long molecule, and in Alzheimer's it seems to stick together, and then those clumps become bigger and bigger, and they're called plaques. So if you look at the brain of someone with Alzheimer's, you have a lot of these plaques. And it's believed that the plaques themselves contribute in part to the disorder because they become inflamed and then the nerves around the plaques die. So there's a huge interest in trying to find treatments to stop the plaques forming and growing. And this is just an interesting observation that maybe cannabis-based products could stop plaques being formed.
Page 263.48. At the bottom?
Just before you continue, you said it stops, may stop plaque forming. But this article speaks about remove plaque forming proteins from brain cells.
Well, yes, that's correct. So it would be that you... Currently, it's very difficult to diagnose Alzheimer's before the plaques are there. I mean, in an ideal world...
No, just the question that you said it
Yes.
prevents, whereas this is speaking about removing.
Well, yes. So the current approaches to Alzheimer's are trying to suck out the plaques.
Yes.
And I think the supposition is that if you could have a treatment that kind of sucked them out the minute they were formed, that would be potentially preventative, because the problem is once they've been we can suck them out once they be, but by that time, by the time we've diagnosed that, people are often demented. But so the idea is that you might be able to suck them out very early so that you don't get the damage from the plaques.
Page 263.48. At the bottom there's a heading, anxiety. Anxiety disorders share features of excessive fear and anxiety which induce psychological and physical symptoms that can cause significant distress or interfere with social, occupational and other areas of functioning. Over the page, the question is posed, are cannabis or cannabinoids an effective treatment for the improvement of anxiety symptoms? Deals with the reviews, the primary literature, the discussion of the findings. And then we have the conclusion at page 263.50. And the conclusion is there is limited evidence that cannabidiol is an effective treatment for the improvement of anxiety symptoms as assessed by a public speaking test in individuals with social anxiety disorders.
Correct.
Explain that to us, please.
So, anxiety, we all know what anxiety is, but for some people, anxiety can turn into a disorder, and social anxiety disorder is a disorder, a very common disorder, particularly in men, where they become very anxious speaking in public, or they become anxious speaking to members of the opposite sex or the same sex if they're that way oriented. And that anxiety is very damaging. It can lead, well, it does, it actually, social anxiety is second only to schizophrenia in reducing the work achievements, the lifetime achievements of people with mental illness. So it can be a very profoundly disabling disorder, because if you can't speak to other people because you blush, you stutter, you choke, you feel faint, then you really have a struggle in life. And many of them turn to alcohol or to stimulants because they find that that can help them. So it's a very disabling disorder. It has a high suicide rate, nearly as high as, the highest suicide rate of any depression, any form of anxiety. Not as high as depression, but significantly high. And many people fail treatments. I have treated hundreds of people with social anxiety disorder over the years, and many of them don't respond even though you're using 3 or 4 different additive treatments. So this particular study was a study that was mimicking social interaction by making people perform a speaking task with or on or off cannabidiol, and it showed, and this was one of the very first studies, it showed that cannabidiol could have an anxiety relieving effect.
Page 263.51. It's a study dealing with Crohn's disease. Can you explain to us what Crohn's disease is?
So Crohn's disease is a disease, it's like rheumatoid arthritis of the bowel. It's a disease where the body's immune system attacks its own bowels. It's associated with enormous pain, episodes of severe diarrhea, loss of weight, and in some cases it can be terminal.
Page 263.51. Studies entitled Cannabis Induces a Clinical Response in Patients with Crohn's Disease, a prospective placebo-controlled study. Next to background and aims, it says the marijuana plant Cannabis sativa has been reported to produce beneficial effects for patients with inflammatory bowel diseases, but this has not been investigated in controlled trials. We performed a prospective trial to determine whether cannabis can induce remission in patients with Crohn's disease. It's a description of the methods and the results. And then under the conclusions it says, although the primary endpoint of the study, induction of remission, was not achieved, a short course, 8 weeks, of THC-rich cannabis produced significant clinical steroid-free benefits to 10 of 11 patients with active Crohn's disease compared with placebo without side effects. Further studies with larger patient groups and a non-smoking mode of intake are warranted. clinicaltrials.gov.
So this is very important, because we know from conversations with people who self-medicate with marijuana, people with Crohn's disease are the ones who often report the greatest, well, they report significant benefit, but they're forced to break the law every day they use it. So the fact that we now have a controlled study that shows that their self-reports actually can be validated in a trial is important. And the other point to make, and another very important point, you see here 3 patients were weaned from steroid dependency. Now, like with all autoimmune diseases, one way of suppressing the immune system is to take steroids. But steroids have profoundly deleterious effects in the long term. They cause bone wasting, they cause muscle wasting, they cause ulcers. and often people die of the steroid rather than the underlying disorder. So anything that can get people off steroids is potentially hugely important for that individual.
Could I ask you to open file 9B? This is again the first to seventh defendants in state's trial bundle. At page 1163. Page 1125 is the start of the document. It's a presentation given affiliated to the Department of Health entitled Medical Cannabis Evidence on Efficacy. And on page 1126 we see the presenters presented by Dr. Donald Abrams, MD, Adrian Few Berman, Susan Wood, Al Kogan, and others that you can read there. And we'll come back to this document in due course, but for present purposes, at page 1163,
yes.
It's entitled Seizures, Surveys and Case Studies. Now, when we talk about seizures here, we're not talking about seizures of cannabis, we're talking about epileptic seizures.
Epileptic fits, yes.
And it says, cannabis preparations are commonly used and recommended for seizure disorders. A survey of parents belonging to a Facebook group that focused on the use of cannabidiol-enriched cannabis for seizures in children with early onset severe forms of epilepsy found that 16 out of 19 parent respondents reported reduced seizure frequency in their children during treatment with cannabidiol-enriched cannabis. 2 reported complete seizure freedom and 8 reported 80% reduction in seizure frequency. And then a case report of a child with Dravet syndrome. What is that?
So Dravet syndrome is a very severe form of childhood epilepsy. This particular girl, Charlotte, I think was having many hundreds of seizures a week. So they were uncontrolled by conventional anti-epileptic medicine, and she was effectively bedbound by her repeated seizures, and her life expectancy would have been extremely short.
It says, case report of the child found that a high concentration CBD THC strain of cannabis, now known as Charlotte's Web, reduced seizure frequency from nearly 50 seizures per day to 2 to 3 nocturnal convulsions per month. This effect has persisted for almost 2 years, and Charlotte was weaned off of other anti-epileptic drugs. Is it because the child's name was Charlotte that the strain is now known as Charlotte's Web?
I believe so. I mean, this, my Lord, this is one of the most remarkable discoveries in medicine in the last, certainly in the treatment of epilepsy, probably ever. So you have a girl who is dying of 50 seizures a day and now can go to school. But to achieve that, her parents had to break the law. In fact, I believe they took her out of state eventually to get the medicine. But this shows how, in a sense, self-medication or medication of a child by a parent can lead to amazing insights into medicine. Now we know that children with Dravet syndrome will have, or at least have a considerable possibility of responding to cannabinoids, and it's being widely used, and it is saving lives. But this would never have been studied. It is inconceivable that any pharmaceutical company would have studied cannabis in this disorder.
But I don't think you need to
keep making that. Okay, all right.
This is re-examination.
All right, sorry.
In that same bundle, I seem to have the incorrect reference. All right, then if I could turn you back in file 2, page 263.60.
263.60.
263.60. This is the Journal of Neuroscience, entitled Chronic Stress Impairs Adrenoceptor-Induced Endocannabinoid-Dependent Synaptic Plasticity in the Dorsal Raphe Nucleus. You'll have to translate that for us, Professor.
Right. So this is the study trying to understand the nature of depression and therefore at the level of chemicals in the brain, at the level of the receptors that the chemicals target, and it's an attempt to provide, I think, a kind of model in which it might be possible to test new drugs which could then perhaps be taken on as a treatment for depression in humans. But this is all in the rat.
Page 263.71. This is entitled Marijuana Compounds Show Promise in Treatment of Cardiac Disease.
Correct.
Explain the outcomes to us.
So this investigator has obtained a patent for cannabis-derived products as a possible treatment for heart failure. I think I explained earlier, though cannabis can have a bad effect in terms of raising blood pressure, there's the possibility that it could have some kind of protective or even enhancing effect on the heart that is suffering from heart failure due to an infarct or some other cause.
263.79. This is again from the publication by the National Academies of Health, Sciences and Engineering. On page 263.79 is the heading Sleep Disorders.
Yes.
263.80 poses the question, are cannabis or cannabinoids an effective treatment for improving sleep outcomes?
Yes.
263.81 is the conclusion. There is moderate evidence that cannabinoids, primarily nabiximols, are an effective treatment to improve short-term sleep outcomes in individuals with sleep disturbance associated with obstructive sleep apnea syndrome, fibromyalgia, chronic pain, and multiple sclerosis. Take us through that, please.
So, this conclusion essentially says that cannabinoids, the nabiximols are it's the Sativex, the prepared combination of THC and cannabidiol. They improve short-term sleep outcomes in individuals with sleep disturbance associated with obstructive sleep apnea syndrome. These are people, usually middle-aged to elderly men, who stop breathing in their sleep. It's a massive problem. Many of them have to have respirators to ventilate them during their sleep, because if they stop breathing, then they are choking. And these are the people that stop breathing and they snore and they wake up in a very agitated state. And those repeated periods of suffocation, you may have hundreds each night, they lead to problems like high blood pressure and also to sleepiness in the day. And these people are much more likely to fall asleep when they're driving, for instance. Sleep apnea is a very difficult syndrome to treat, because normal sleeping pills, like Zolpidem, they suppress respiration. So you can't use them in people with obstructive sleep apnea. So a cannabinoid, one of the advantages of cannabinoids, we've already explained, it doesn't suppress respiration. So this is a particularly interesting innovation for people who can't generally it wouldn't be safe to take other kinds of sleeping pills. Fibromyalgia, this is a syndrome where people have a lot of pain throughout their body, typically in muscles and in the tendons between muscles and joints. It's a disabling condition, not easy to treat. Very few treatments exist, and again, it causes problems with sleep. Chronic pain, well, we know pain keeps you awake. And multiple sclerosis, the multiple sclerosis patients sleep poorly because they get spasms and that wakes them up. So this is at least promising, suggestive data that there could be utility here.
But I see there's 1 minute to go. As you know, my Lord, Professor Nutt is flying back to the United Kingdom this evening. And so, as discussed in chambers, it seems clear that the trial won't finish in this session, can't finish in this session. So we'll have to either get Professor Nutt back here or come to some other arrangement for the next session, presumably next year sometime.
Yes.
So we'll continue with the re-examination, my Lord, in due course.
Yes. I take it that there's no difficulty. This has been discussed in chambers, Mr. Bukaba, Mr. Willis. Just to continue with the re-examination.
There's been an expansion of evidence in any event in re-examination that was never addressed in chief.
Well, I'm not
So
sure.
we're probably going to have to cross-examine. We're going to have to apply to your lordship to cross-examine. So we can't object to that, my lord. I don't know what Mr. Bukaba feels.
Yes.
So for that reason, we don't have an objection.
No objection. Thank you.
Well, we'll be
So
starting
will
at
you continue?
9:30 or 10 tomorrow morning.
Pardon?
Would we be starting at 9:30 or 10 tomorrow morning?
You have your previous witness.
Yes, Mr. Patterson will
continue?
be coming back.
We can continue at 9:30. The court adjourns.
Liring ka Setswana.